Thank you very much, Mark, for this introduction. I have to apologize for the long list of duties, but this, in a longer lifetime, some things are coming together, and forget it immediately, I am inviting you. My next remark for introduction, I think by intermission, a nice mistake was happening concerning the title of my speech. I think I wanted to speak about, is Europe falling into pieces? And so it came out in two pieces. But in a certain way, I think if we're looking to history of Europe, I think you can learn that is really happening. I think more than 2,000 years ago, it happened that it was falling into two pieces in the Roman Empire concerning Christianity, Orthodox Christianity, and later on Catholic. Then further on, it happened to fall into pieces by the Iron Curtain. 2,000 years later, we have a division between the richer and the poor, also politically. EU members and non-EU members, we have the division between euro as a currency and non-euro, of Schengen, the rules concerning the border procedures and not Schengen, and so on and so on. I think now we have divisions, for example, countries who are prepared to take refugees and not taking refugees. Also a division line within Europe with, for sure, some problems. But I want to speak about falling into pieces, because I think that's a real challenge which is existing. It sounds a little bit pessimistic, but I may say, I think looking to Europe for my lifetime, and I'm born through the Second World War, I think the development of Europe was impressive, and we overcame a lot of things. And it's a great success story. Even the entity of the European Union is something which was never existing before in the world. It has a certain characteristic, not being a state, being a corporation, being more than a corporation, being more than a federation. And here we are on the bricks, in which direction, for sure, is it going. There are still some ideas to divide it in core Europe, which is moving further on to come closer, and those who are afterwards, which is not a very good idea because you are again dividing Europe. And to say it quite clear, I'm a fan of a unified Europe, even if it is extremely difficult to do it. Let's make the comment that this Europe has grown fast, but for the moment we are missing a kind of leadership. That's one of the discussions I want to touch here earlier. What are the problems? For example, some countries who are very critical on the common Europe, and here ideas are running around. There are nice abbreviations existing about Grexit, Greek shall pushed out, they don't want to go out. Brexit, it may be that the United Kingdom want to go out. I have the understanding that Great Britain has always the difficulties to be a part of Europe. Friends of my generation in London are always telling me if they are going to the continent, I'm going to Europe. But now I think we have a tunnel with a railway and the highway, which is very much connecting in a certain way. Maybe the attitude will change time by time, and everything needs a lot of time. But for sure, we had better time for Europe. I think the difficulties now existing are not only the so often mentioned refugee problem, because this is also a traditional problem. Even the end of the Roman Empire was done by refugees, by migration. I think it's already forgotten, and the reasons for migration in this time were quite the same as today. It was climate change, it was poor people who want to have more, who want to come to the richer parts, and so on and so on. I think here things are repeating in history, which is very much happening for sure. There's an interesting other division here in Europe, the tendency for less Europe and for more Europe, which is not very much seen in reality and not very much checked by the public discussion. I think we overcame a lot of difficulties in the last years by more Europe. If you are looking to the crisis concerning the currency, we are getting more Europe by the European Central Bank. The decision-making by the European Central Bank kept the balance here for the euro. and kept the system of the banks with a lot of money spent on, but for sure it was really working, because otherwise we would have a bigger economic crisis. Maybe that the challenge of security now existing is also creating a lot of more Europe. I want to make a side remark. It might create here a battle between freedom and security. For the moment, we have a challenge for having more security, more control, more common institution, and to lift even Schengen and so on and so on. But that means that we are getting difficulties with freedom, and maybe since the French Revolution ever, I think the question of freedom and the protection of freedom was one of the key issues of Europe. That's for sure one side. There's also another side of this development. I think sometimes it is overseen in the public discussion and by politicians that the positioning of Europe is one of the key challenges. I think we have to say it quite straight. Europe is only 7% of the global population, and not more, 7%. We are still between 20 and 25% of the GDP of the world, which is giving some importance and some possibilities and some obligations also. But you can expect that this part of the economic power of Europe will go down, not only by economic crisis, but even more that other parts are coming up, like China, India, South America, and so on, which is quite good. And so far, the real challenge is for Europe to position itself in this global process. I think here the discussion is not intense and deep enough within Europe. We have still a very Eurocentric view, which I think is a mistake because it's not anymore true. What we have to discuss, and I think to formulate it quite exactly, what is the role of Europe in this global context? What can we contribute to the other parts of the globe? What is the influence of the globe on Europe, and what have we to do in this? We are in midst of this process, but the discussion is not too deep and is not too serious. It is still a very Eurocentric discussion. But may I say, I think the contribution of Europe in the past, since the end of the Second World War, was quite a great one to peace. I mentioned it in a discussion before. I think what was the real result and achievement of Europe was a period of peace which we never had in the history before. I think there is a famous quotation of Winston Churchill about the Balkans. He said, the Balkans have more history as they can consume. May I say, that's totally right for Europe. We have too much history that we are able to consume, but a little bit we learned out of this, and I think the result was the European Union and this coming together. Maybe in the moment it is under critiques and is in difficulties, but I think we have to continue on this. That's a real challenge of the refugee question, because some politicians are asking, we have to cancel Schengen, okay, we have to wait on the borderlines, but you should not forget, I think Europe is a continent with the longest borderlines ever possible, because smaller countries in comparison with the rest of the world are here existing, and that's creating, for sure, this situation. We are also, until now, not really able to overcome history. An interesting result, I think for a lot of you, it's not a very interesting story, but concerning the refugees coming to Germany, going through Austria, the difficulties between the peoples at the Balkans are coming up. I'm registering that for example, the Croats are blamed for their behavior towards the refugees by whom? By the Serbs, by the neighbors. The Slovenes are blamed by their neighbors, the Croatians and the Serbs, and so on and so on. And even we Austrians are blamed by the Hungarians concerning our behavior, therefore we are blaming the Hungarians for our behavior. All these deep stories in history, and memory in history is some very dangerous thing. This memory on history is again coming up, and this is against Europe. And for sure it's against the culture of Europe, which for sure is really necessary. I think what we have to do, the strong argument in our days is European values. That means human rights for sure, and the way to handle conflicts and so on and so on. But it is also in a certain way interrupted. I think this is a critical role of Vladimir Putin in this context concerning Ukraine. But I think here I'm a little bit in difference to one speech we heard. I think we have to look also history, because, for example, Crimea was for a very long time a part of Russia. It was 70 years ago a gift of Khrushchev to Ukraine, given on behalf of the Soviet Union. I think the history is quite different, because Sevastopol was always the position of the Russian Navy, and there were a lot of wars between the Ottoman Empire and the Russians and so on and so on. History is quite a difficult thing, because you can find a justification for everything by a certain move with history, which for sure is here existing. So far we have to overcome history by studies of history, what is connecting us here. I think it's also a possibility to overcome all these division lines. In a certain way, ladies and gentlemen, we have to reinvent Europe. Reinvent Europe under the condition under which it is existing. I repeat, under the global conditions, we have to reinvent Europe. Jacques Delors, from my impression here, the best president of the European Commission ever, said a very important sentence, and I want to repeat it. You cannot love a common market. That's true. To fall in love with the common market is a nonsense. It's very good for the economy, maybe that we are becoming richer, and so on and so on. The second sentence was, we have to give Europe a soul. I think this is a real demand which is existing. That's not happening from one day or the other, but it can only happening by the way having knowledge about each other, knowing the history and how to overcome, having the right exchange, and so on and so on. This is reinventing Europe. For the moment, it's not going quite well, because everybody is saying we have a crisis. If you are looking to the medias in Europe, you can see we have the crisis of the months. It's always coming up a new crisis, and so on, really horrible. And so I'm here very critical on the way of the medias. I think every media wants to have its own crisis and making popular. I want to look to the word crisis, and language is helping here also. The word crisis is coming out of the old Greek language. The basic word was krino. And if you look to this word, what does it mean? In translation, it means to judge and to decide. May I say, a crisis is a very positive thing. If you are forced to judge and to decide, I think it's moving you forward. And I think this is the intention in which Europe has to go for sure. I think here we have to do a lot of changes. Here we need more Europe. For example, by my job concerning the Balkans and other European affairs, I'm a fan of Europe, by the way, and European unification. But I'm also critical how it is done. One of my critiques is that education is not a European subject. Education is still the responsibility of the nation state. Personally, I may say I have my doubts if the nation state is able to handle the situation in which we are. I think the nation state is in limits. And by the development, I think it had not any more the importance they are doing. The governments, I think, are refusing to give up responsibilities of the nation state. But as a former politician, I may tell you it's a very primitive reason. The nation state, as a member state of the European Union, has to decide to give up political responsibility to European institutions. I think which government is eager to lose importance. They have to decide of losing importance. That makes it very much difficult. So far, I'm not quite sure that the governments are able to do it, and it will be a job of the civil society to push the governments in this direction, not even by the political parties, because they are also looking to their own importance, but I will cover this point later on. So far, I think we need a European education under global auspices in the directions that we have a global responsibility. And here I may say culture is helpful. It was already said that culture can be also a reason for more division, but it can be also a reason for more cooperation. We have some fields of culture where we have no difficulties with the language. That's, for example, music. I think you have a certain global extension of music and a global understanding. That's really globalization. Why? You don't need any translation. I think it is possible to understand pop or even Beethoven without any translation. I think because music is going to the heart, it's going to the feeling, and so on and so on. It's more difficult with the language, but here I may say you have also other parts of culture like architecture and so on, which are developing under global auspices, and I think that's extremely important. On this part, and I can speak lengthy about this, but on this part, I have to mention also the medias. I think in this context, the media are the real problem. I think the intention of media is to communicate. Sometimes I have the impression that some parts of the media are not prepared for communicating. They are prepared for making divisions. And with a different language, I have mentioned it yesterday also, and I don't want to repeat this. I'll give you one example. I think we are living in the time of TV shows. What is happening by TV shows? You have talk shows nearly every evening. I invite you, if you are going at home in this evening, switch through the 40, 50 channels you can look through. I think in 50% of them you will see a talk show in the European channels. I think always the same, sitting there and making the same comments. Sometimes I'm able to repeat it before they are said, but this is another question. Are you aware, and I'm asking the Europeans, that there is no European talk show? No European talk show. I think I was very angry about, and I went to the European Broadcasting Union, which is a cooperation of the public broadcasters here in Europe. I was asking, why is there no European talk show? The answer was a very straight one. We have to divide the advertisement between the national companies, and nobody wants to do this. Huh? Strong argument by economy, by balance sheets, and so on and so on. A complete nonsense, because a simultaneous translation is already invented without any problem. It can be really done. So I'm saying, and maybe it sounds to you ridiculous, we have really one European talk show, that's the Eurosong contest. Because at the Eurosong contest, the different groups, the different countries are judging the others. And may I say that's the most political activity which is happening, because here you can see who likes whom and who is disgusting whom, giving the points. They are not listening to the songs. They are not important. It is an expression of a certain behavior. I think I'm inviting the political scientists to look to this, because it's giving quite more information than polls and anything else. Here you can see, in a certain way, in a very strange way, it is existing, but that's for sure not enough. But to set it quite clear, not only by European talk shows you can create a common Europe and a common understanding of the global effectiveness. I think it's very important, because now the different national companies like CNN, BBC, Deutsche Welle, and so on, try to spread over in other parts, I think, here to get more information. Is it a competition or it is a cooperation? I think you can answer it for yourself. So far, that's the reason why at the end of my speech I want to focus on the civil society. I'm skeptical concerning the political cooperation, because here it's a question of political power, and for sure it's quite necessary, and it has to be done in this direction. It's developing. Hopefully it's developing quickly enough. Because we have some other challenges. It's not only the concept of European cooperation. I think there are some proposals existing, different concepts. For example, if you are listening to Vladimir Putin, he is a concept of Eurasia. I think it reaches, for sure, from Russia, Belarus, and so on, until Central Asia, and so on and so on. If I'm listening to my Turkish friends, they have a similar concept, together with the Chinese, Silk Road cooperation. Also a bigger economic area, which for sure is right. And on the other side, TTIP is this also. I don't want to interfere in the question how TTIP is done. The basic idea for sure is right. How it is done is under question. Here you can see also a certain understanding or misunderstanding which is happening. It's not necessary to discuss how the voluntary judiciary is done on this subject. It's quite more important under which rules it is done, because we have to move in the direction of common rules. And that might be one of the great contributions which can happen on the European side. We are in the beginning. Hopefully we are quick enough, because there's one characteristic of our time: everything is going quite quickly. Hopefully I was quick enough to speak and to use my time. Thank you very much for your patience. Nobody's in charge. So may I say, the next one is Mr. Johansson as a moderator.
It's working now, yes. Thank you very much for your illuminating speech, and I think we have time probably for one question, but only one question.
It's better for me to sit down. Okay, here. Here in the fourth row, somebody is showing up. No micro?
Hello, it's working. Okay. Hi, sir. Good morning. I'm Nizam. I'm from the Philippines. As someone who studied journalism and an advocate of conflict-sensitive journalism, I cannot agree more with your statement on how we should actually include media in the discussion. I was hoping to ask this question yesterday, but unfortunately we didn't have time. So it's nice that you were still able to include in your speech the idea of media, because I personally think we're actually underestimating how influential media really is in terms of cultural diplomacy, culture being dynamic as it is. And with the advent of technology, media has totally changed how we look at culture and how we live our lives. For example, we can see it very apparent with what happened in Rwanda, for an instance. We can also see it with what happened in France, with the Charlie Hebdo, for example, the issue on satirical news contents, for an instance. We can also see it in what happened in the Egypt Revolution, for an instance, with Twitter, with Facebook, for an instance. My question would be, do you think it's about time that we include media in the idea of cultural diplomacy, in cultural talks, for example, in dialogues, for example? And do you think that with what's happening with how they package news, for an instance, do you think that the international community can actually do something about how media specifically is trying to package conflict and contributing to what we want in terms of forwarding the agenda of cultural diplomacy? Thank you.
Thank you very much for your questions and also for your comment. You said we have to include media in the cultural diplomacy. I think, may I say, the media is the basics of cultural diplomacy, because diplomacy and culture means mutual understanding. In which way is mutual understanding happening? I think in the developing of democracy in Athens, I think it was quite easy, because they were coming together at the marketplace of Athens. Here communication was easy, because they can talk to each other and somebody can speak and so on and so on. There's a very interesting sentence by Aristotle. He said, democracy reaches as far as the voice of the herald. I think that means democracy existing as far you are understanding each other. If you are not understanding each other or you are not listening, there's no democracy possible. This, for sure, are the medias today, and I think we have to more focus on this, because, as I mentioned yesterday, the speech of hatred, for sure, is very much existing also. So far, we have to develop some rules. For sure, basics here existing are ethical norms. I think to offend somebody is really against the rules, and so on and so on. But may I say, by the possibility of internet, it might be necessary to develop even more rules, and maybe to sentence somebody who is asking for killing somebody or offending by his human rights, and so on and so on. That's not yet developed. Even I think the development of a better mutual understanding is extremely difficult. You hear that I was very much involved also in the Balkans, in Southeast Europe. We are doing here an organization, Southeast European Media Organization. What are we trying to do? First of all, to bring the journalists out of different countries, languages, and so on together, that they are discussing, and that they are forced to present their exposition of the development of the different countries to get here more mutual understanding. Here, may I say, by all the huge development in which we are in the beginning. I'm doing here in Center for Democracy and Reconciliation for Southeast Europe, forget it, but we are doing now a TV show, so-called Vicinities, Okruženje in Serbian, Croatian language. That means we are presenting one country to the other, to the neighbor, that there is a better understanding. You have a strange situation, you are not aware of this, that's not possible, but you have a strange situation that in this area where these countries, where these peoples have been together for a very long time, partly in the Ottoman Empire and the Habsburg Empire in Yugoslavia, I think there's a misunderstanding. They have a long common history, but they have a deep animosity against each other, and we have to use the medias, I think, to overcome it. That's for a small part of Europe. We have to do it even more. And I think here the electronic medias, in a certain way, are a real chance, but they have to be used. That's a challenge of the civil society. Don't wait for the different states, because the different states are looking for more power and are campaigning. If you don't believe it, look to Russia Today, which you have in Europe spread over. Also the Chinese international TV is looking in this direction, and may I say, CNN is also partly strange on some things, being very American and self-defending in this direction. So far, I can only underline this, and maybe it might be a possibility for ICT also to do such an event as this. Many thanks for doing this, on the question of the medias, together with journalists, not only with the readers and listeners and those who are looking, with the journalists and the owners of the medias. They are playing a very important role because they want to earn money. For example, Western European companies went in the Balkans. They did a horrible job there because they tried to earn a lot of money, but they did nothing for a common European understanding. I'm extremely critical, but this has to be expressed. I think public opinion is a real weapon if it is done in the right way, in favor of more tolerance, in favor of more culture.
Dr. Busek, I would ask you to stay on the stage because after the speech we now have the panel discussion. But before we transition to the panel discussion, could you please all help in expressing our sincere gratitude to the Honorable Dr. Erhard Busek. Thank you very much. Okay.